5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hello, space enthusiasts. Welcome to another episode of the Space Business Podcast, where we investigate all the exciting ways in which people participate in the new space economy by conversations with entrepreneurs, executives, investors, and other members of the space family. My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor in and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by NanoAvionics, a satellite bus manufacturer and mission integrator. Their satellite technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation for various purposes, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out and also check out my episode with their CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University, or ISU, which is also our partner in this podcast. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide, ranging from executive courses lasting a few days all the way to a one-year master's. Check them out at isunet.edu. Okay, so this is the second episode in our holiday doubleheader, and I did promise you more gift ideas. A little while ago, Michael Markesbery, the founder of an apparel startup called OROS, reached out to me. Okay, so now you're thinking, what does a clothing company have to do with space? Here's what. OROS's clothes protect you from the cold by using some of the same materials that are used to insulate some spacecraft and even Mars rovers. Let's listen to Michael tell us all about it. Hey space enthusiasts, welcome to another episode of the Space Business Podcast. I'm really thrilled today with today's episodes. We have Michael Markesbery. He's the CEO and co-founder of OROS. And this episode is a little bit different than our previous episodes. This is actually the first time we have a company that I would characterize as a spin-off technology from space company. Hey Michael, how are you doing?
Great. Raphael, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. So Michael, why don't you just start off giving us sort of the short summary / elevator pitch on OROS.
Of course. As you said, I'm Michael Markesbery, co-founder and CEO of OROS. And OROS took the same insulation that NASA used to insulate the Mars rovers and put it into apparel so you can have incredibly thin gear that keeps you very warm.
Well, that sounds very exciting. And, I can sort of immediately sympathize with that because I think like you as well, I'm a pretty outdoorsy guy. I've, actually been to both the North Pole and the South Pole. And so it's obviously very cold at those locations. And, usually when I'm at the poles, I'm walking around in these like giant goose feathered down jackets. It's basically like wearing a comforter. So, anything that makes it very thin, that sounds very cool. How do you guys come up with this? What's the backstory there? How do you guys get in touch with NASA and got your hands on this technology?
When I was at university, my sophomore year, I went backpacking across Europe and ended up climbing the tallest mountain in the Northeast Swiss Alps. It had a very similar experience to you in the South Pole. Like I'm on top of this mountain and I'm looking like the Michelin Man. Like I have on all this bulk and all these layers. And I'm thinking, there's got to be a better way to cut the bulk and cut the layers and still stay warm. What didn't make sense to me is like, there's been so much innovation in the world. We've landed a human on the moon. We've created the internet. We've done all these phenomenal things, but outerwear hasn't really changed. We're still stuffing jackets with animal byproducts, goose down, the same thing we've been using to insulate ourselves for the last 1,000 years. And in a world where technology is evolving so quickly, I guess my question was, should an outerwear as well? And so I came back to the US, and in college, I was a huge science geek. I was studying to go to med school. And when you're on that path, you have to join a research lab and get publications on whatever you're working on. And so that's what I did. And I got really lucky. And through the research I was doing, I ended up getting this scholarship from NASA created by the Mercury 7 astronauts called the Astronaut Scholarship. And through the Astronaut Scholarship, I ended up learning about this NASA tech called aerogel. And NASA said that aerogel was the lowest thermal conductive solid in existence. A bunch of fancy words meaning that that, as you know, the best insulation in the universe. So good that NASA was using this stuff to insulate the Mars rovers and all these other applications in space. And well, I'm thinking like, hold on, space is negative 455 degrees Fahrenheit. It's one of the coldest temperatures in the universe. And you're using this to keep things warm in space. How come this isn't in every single jacket in the world? It would have totally solved this problem I had on top of the mountain when I looked like the Michelin Man. And so that kind of bugged me. Like, And I learned that aerogel's been around since 1931, right? Like it's not a new material. And so there had to be a reason why this stuff wasn't being used ubiquitously. And I remember I ordered my first piece of aerogel, opened up the packaging, flipped it up, put it in my hand. And aerogel looks really cool, by the way. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's light blue, translucent. It's called blue smoke sometimes. It's awesome. But put it in my hand and it just shattered into 1,000 little pieces. Turned out aerogel is incredibly brittle. So not really good for many applications here on Earth. And so it became our passion project to just figure out a way to take the best insulation in the universe, this aerogel stuff, and just make it flexible and durable enough for applications here on Earth. And we spent the remainder of our college careers working on this. And by our senior years of college, 2 years later, blew through the money from the astronaut scholarship, but ended up creating the first ever flexible, durable aerogel composite in the world. And that's what's called Solar Core, and that's what's in all of our gear today. That was really the genesis of OROS.
Which means you can now do things like extreme skiing without kind of having a material like your jacket shatter on you, I assume.
Totally. Yeah. So to your point, the Solar Core is completely flexible and durable. It acts just like any other insulation. The Solar Core has two big benefits over every other insulation in the world. You mentioned extreme skiing. The Solar Core, number one, is the warmest insulation we've tested. We've tested it against over 250 installations. I've yet to find anything warmer. And that's great. It's warmer than everything else out there. But the real benefit gets back to the challenge that I had on top of the mountain when I looked at the Michelin Man, the same challenge you had when you were in the South Pole. And that challenge is bulk. Every insulation since the beginning of time has needed bulk, or what the industry calls loft, to work. And that's because every insulation, including Goose Down, all these insulations trap air. And the more air they trap, the more insulation they give you. The problem is that air takes volume or space. So the more air you funnel in there, the puffier and puffier your jacket gets. That's why a big puffy jacket keeps you so warm, is it has all that airspace or volume or loft. And if you compress it, you lose the airspace, thereby losing the ability to stay warm. Point being, since the beginning of time, there's been this dependency on volume or bulk to stay warm. That's not true with Solar Core. Solar Core, under compression, no airspace, maintains 97% of its thermal performance. Or said another way, for the first time in history, you no longer have to look like the Michelin Man to stay warm. And that's really the big difference with Solar Core.
What does that mean as an extreme? Because talking about Michelin Man, so yeah, I've seen it at the poles, but another sort of, example other people might be familiar with is that the typical guys who climb really high mountains like Mount Everest, they all look like Michelin Man. And then of course it kind of makes sense. But does that mean at an extreme, like those guys could now be using much thinner suits for even extreme activities like that?
Exactly. In those extreme conditions, you can be using way thinner pieces of outerwear. Our Orion Parka was named by Forbes the warmest jacket on Earth, and it's been to the negative 40-degree Fahrenheit temperatures of Antarctica with nothing underneath. And it looks like a typical winter jacket. Where that gets really cool is that same philosophy of having to wear less bulk and staying as warm or warmer, that same philosophy can be carried to someone who lives in Chicago or London. They, instead of wearing their typical big puffy winter jacket, can also wear something significantly less bulky and stay incredibly warm, regardless of if you're that person who's summiting a mountain in the Northeast Swiss Alps or someone who's just spending your weekend in Chicago. In both cases, that philosophy holds true.
This is also something I intuitively understand because, I used to work in investment banking in New York. And like you said, of course, it can get very cold in New York in the winter sometimes. And then whatever you were wearing, like you were really nice, like Armani suit or something for banking. And then in the cold winter days, you had one of these things which basically look like a comforter on top of your nice suit. I guess what you're saying is that now maybe I could put like a vest out of your material under my suit and that would take care of the cold?
That's right. That's correct. We create a variety of product offerings to suit whatever the end use case is. So we have our outerwear, which includes products like the Orion Parka that I mentioned. We also have a snow sport ski focused line within the outerwear called the Endeavor series. So we have our Endeavor jacket for those applications. But we have our performance wear line. These are things like our insulated leggings for women, our insulated quarter zip, which was named Runner's World Gear of the Year. And then also, to your point, as you mentioned, we have our quantum vests and products like that as well for more urban use cases.
And I was on your website just before the call and including on the online shopping section. Of course, I was crushed because the thing that I really want, which is you have actually one jacket which has the NASA warm logo, is apparently it's sold out.
So October 1st was the beginning of our season this year and marked the launch of our Fall 20 collection. We launched our season with the 39A flight jacket. It was a collab between OROS and NASA and just 400 units, so super limited, but the jacket had really awesome some NASA branding, which is great. But the coolest thing about it is every jacket came signed by an astronaut in the U.S. Astronaut Hall of Fame, an astronaut by the name of Kathy Sullivan. And Kathy is incredible. Kathy is the first American woman to go on a spacewalk. She's also the first woman to go to the deepest part of the ocean, and the first human to do both. So she calls herself the most vertical person in the world, which is a really awesome title to have. And OROS's mantra, our mission is find your beyond. And that's something that Kathy really lives up to well. So we were really excited to have her partner on the jacket. And what we didn't tell anybody until the jacket was released is on the back, there was an Easter egg. And the Easter egg was a quote from Neil Armstrong. And someone asked Neil, hey, why would you try to do this crazy thing? Why would you try to go to the moon? And Neil said, it's in the nature of human beings to take on challenges, just as it's in the nature of salmon to swim upstream. That quote resonates with us on a deep level. It gets back to this idea of finding your beyond, right? And so that quote is actually on the back of the jacket. It looks super cool. Anyway, we launched the jacket on October 1st, which is also NASA's birthday, by the way. NASA was founded on October 1st, 1958. So there's some good juju there, but launched it on October 1st and ended up selling out in less than an hour, which was super cool. And I've been getting a really positive reception from those that were lucky enough to buy it. Will there definitely be more collabs with NASA in the future?
Yeah, and I shall be refreshing my browser until the jacket comes up for sale again, I guess. But I'm happy you brought our conversation back to NASA because, of course, we are a space podcast, so we should be talking about NASA. And I want to take a step back to actually sort of the beginning of all of this. So because this was originally a technology developed for NASA, like you said, or maybe it wasn't. I guess you said it was around since 1931. My question was going to be was that some technology that you were able to just get your hands on, or was the IP owned by NASA and you had to negotiate with them, or how did that all work?
Aerogel was created in 1931, well before NASA's existence. And, NASA was founded October 1st, 1958, as I mentioned. NASA was just one of the first to utilize aerogel in any sort of application. They used it in the cryogenic tanks on the shuttles. They used it on the Mars rovers, yada, 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 well before there were really any commercial applications for aerogel. So there was no IP that NASA held. And also on the original aerogel, regarding the original aerogel IP is long since expired. If it was created in 1931, totally. So all the IP that exists on that original aerogel now is how do we make it faster? How do we make it cheaper? Yada, yada, yada. And there are a variety of suppliers across the world. There's about 5 major ones that are producing aerogel that you can work with to get your hands on that original aerogel. Getting access to that original aerogel was pretty easy.
That makes sense. And how is this the current cooperation you have with NASA? How did that go? How was NASA immediately receptive to this? How is working with NASA been?
With regard to what?
I guess you're cooperating at least on the 39A jacket, right? Where you're using the NASA warm logo.
So we've worked with 2 groups there. One is NASA. You have to get approval to brand anything with NASA. And so we had to go through that process. The other thing about the NASA jacket is OROS started with this scholarship from the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation. And it was really important to us to give back to that group as well. And so we gave 10% of sale of the 39A flight jacket to the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, and worked with them to get Kathy on board and all these other things. So whether it was NASA or the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, working with both groups has been phenomenal.
And so getting that collaboration with Kathy and then getting the rights to use the Neil Armstrong quote, that was all pretty straightforward and people were on board right away.
Yeah. What makes OROS different than a lot of other consumer brands is there's true heritage in NASA and space exploration. It's truly the foundation of our company and our origin story. And so we found that whether it was getting a license on the Neil Armstrong quote or working with Kathy or NASA or the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, all of these agencies and groups were really excited to not just partner with OROS, but in the form and the manifestation of a physical product, celebrate all that's been done in space exploration in NASA's career.
How important, or how much do you, beyond just having the 39A jacket, how much do you play the space angle in marketing to your customers and sort of presenting the philosophy of your company, and how important do you think it is for your customers?
Quite a bit. You can go on our site today and you'll see right on the homepage on tile 2 it is a mention that we've taken this antiquated industry and brought it into the space age using space age tech. This idea of, the advantages that the space age has and space exploration has, and bringing those benefits into consumer products is a central thesis to not just our marketing, but who we are. And so it's a pretty big piece for sure.
Really asking because, one thing that I'm very involved in is sort of what I call general outreach and education about space and, all of the exciting things which are going on in space. But, one of the things we as a space community still struggle with is that the space community tends to still be a very defined group of, like I always joke, it's like the same 1,000, 2,000 people you see at every space conference. And we're really trying to get many more people outside that hardcore excited about space. And actually recently we ran, a couple of workshops in the space community to see how can we get more people involved and also like the younger generation and everything, and people who are not, space engineers or, aero-astro engineers, who just find space exciting for those, exploration aspects that you mentioned. And there was some really interesting ideas came out of that. One was basically gaming, which I think makes a lot of sense. You may know things like Kerbal Space Program. So the games make sense. But then another suggestion which repeatedly came up was sort of like urban wear and like clothing, and bringing space closer to a broader audience via clothing. And so it's kind of fascinating that you guys would kind of fit right into that aspect. That's why I'm asking, how much you've been playing that angle in marketing, whether there's any sort of future plans as well to use that space angle more in your marketing to customers.
The interesting thing is, anytime we mention NASA-utilized insulation or space tech, any of those words that relate to what it is that we're doing within our ads, our click-through rate on our ads improves by at least 20 to 25%. There is I believe, a general interest and intrigue in the space and space exploration community. And I think it's something that's also been revitalized, especially among, to your point, the younger community in the last 10 years with this reinvigoration of space exploration. Whether you can credit SpaceX for that or NASA or Blue Origin, who knows? But we definitively see the data every year across our ads and what's performing and what's not. And the data doesn't lie. As for what's coming in the future, when Rith and I started the company, we had a very simple goal. We wanted to create a long sleeve shirt that you could wear in sub-freezing temperatures and still stay warm. So not just thinner or warmer outerwear like we make today, but getting rid of the necessity of outerwear entirely, where all you would need is this long sleeve shirt to stay warm. And to do that, we had a fundamental problem. We needed to make a fiber that could power this long sleeve shirt. We needed to make the warmest fiber in the world. I can't go into too much detail at this time, but we're roughly 12 months away from releasing that fiber in that long sleeve shirt to the world. And in the process, we've been working very closely with NASA, especially in our R&D partners, on bringing that long sleeve shirt to market. And we're incredibly, incredibly excited. So I guess said another way, there's definitely some really cool things coming in terms of partnerships with NASA and space exploration in the future.
And the partnership with NASA, of course, is very cool. But you did mention these companies like, SpaceX, which obviously have gotten a lot of people excited about space and continue to get more people excited about space. And of course, the interesting thing is SpaceX and actually Blue Origin as well, they both have online shops where you can buy like basically apparel, with SpaceX. I mean, I have a Occupy Mars t-shirt lying around somewhere here. I think you even have
me too.
I think I have the new Mars t-shirt as well. But anyway, have you guys, is that also something that you guys are planning? I mean, I guess you could cooperate with those companies as well, right?
Totally. Doing a collab with some of those companies would be absolutely awesome, and something that we would love to do. That's a beautiful idea, and something that I think would generate a lot of hype and awareness, to your point.
Have you guys done some, analysis of your customer base, sort of like who your customers are, how you would characterize them?
100%. Our customer is who we call the modern urbanite. They're living in an urban environment, but like to spend their weekends outside. If you take a map of geographic distribution of our consumer across the U.S., and the U.S. makes up historically 70% of our purchases annually, the number one location on a volume basis is New York. The number one on a per capita basis, though, is Chicago. On volume, number one is New York, number two, Chicago. And then it goes Boston, Boston, then it goes West Coast. But the point is, it's a consumer that's living in the city that spends their weekend outside doing a variety of different activities. Our target consumer is generally late 20s to mid 30s and very active on the weekends. What we found, though, is while that is our largest consumer base to date, we also have the secondary consumer base that is incredibly large. And they're who we call the warmth seeker. The warmth seeker, just like the modern urbanite, lives in this urban environment in the same cities. They're in New York, they're in Chicago, they're in Boston, they're on the West Coast. The difference is, instead of spending their weekends outside doing a variety of different activities, they just want to stay warm where they walk their dog on a cold Chicago winter day. That's fundamentally one of the big differences. And they also tend to skew a little bit older, more the mid 40s to mid 50s range. But those are our two largest consumer bases at OROS.
I feel like most of Canada should be wearing your products too.
Totally. Our largest markets outside of the US, number one is Japan, which has been growing very rapidly this year. We're excited to continue to grow it in 2021. Number two is, to your point, Canada. And then three is Germany. The top two technical apparel markets outside of the US are Germany and Japan. But there's a big need for warm outerwear in Canada. So that's why those three markets make up 2, 3, and 4 on our list behind the US in terms of historical sales.
It's funny you mentioned walking dogs. I immediately thought there might even be a market for having like a little dog sweater that people in Chicago put on their dogs when it gets really cold.
You would be surprised at the amount of customer service inputs we get from customers making that request. It is definitely not the first time we've heard it. It definitely could make it for an interesting product for sure.
Have you guys managed to get this into the hands of some, famous customers? I was thinking about like the extreme skiers, right? The Candice Thorax of the world. I don't know, mountain climbers, free climbers, anybody like that?
Totally. We have a great batch of influencers that either have organically or not organically got a hold of our products. And with the 39A flight jacket, there's some really awesome influencers that I'm really excited about that got their hands on the product. I'm not allowed to say who they are yet, for sure. We've been very fortunate on the influencer side, both from just an athlete perspective in the outdoor community, as well as those that are a little bit more in pop culture.
Let me just switch gears slightly and also talk, because to some extent, this is also a podcast about entrepreneurship, right? And sort of meant to inspire people how they start up companies. When you guys first came up with this idea, sort of like, how has your journey been? How has it been to get support for this also, for example, on the fundraising side?
As I mentioned, by our senior year of college, we had SolarCore. We were out of money at this point, Rith and I, and we didn't know if anyone would want to buy it. So we ended up prototyping our first ever jacket with SolarCore right as we were graduating college. And it was an ugly jacket designed by two kids in a college dorm room that knew nothing about apparel, but it worked, right? It was our minimum viable product. It truly was an incredibly warm jacket. Are you familiar with Kickstarter?
Sure.
Perfect. We launched it on Kickstarter right as we were graduating with the goal of $100,000. For Rith and me, this was our deciding factor between OROS and med school. I hit the $100,000, tried the whole OROS thing, plan B of med school. Launched the campaign, and in the first 36 hours hit $125,000. More money than two kids from the Midwest have ever seen before in our lives, right? And closed the campaign at 300 something. And that was the start of OROS in 2015. It's been a little over 5 years, and so much has happened. We raised over $10 million of venture capital from some really awesome VC partners who we're honored to work with, partnered with the Department of Defense on a variety of initiatives, built up a phenomenal team, moved to Portland, Oregon. Portland's the technical apparel capital of the world. It's North American headquarters of Adidas, headquarters of Nike, et cetera, and built up an amazing product team. And the business has been doubling every single year since inception, which makes investors happy and all those things.
This $10 million you raised, was that primarily for expanding production or marketing, or how was that money used?
It was a split between R&D on our next gen tech, this long sleeve shirt that we're talking about that comes out in 12 months, and then also marketing and team expansion. Those are the two main initiatives.
How big is the team now?
We are 14 today.
You're manufacturing in the US?
All of our outerwear is made in Vietnam, and then all of our performance wear, like our quarter zips and leggings, etc., is made in El Salvador.
I assume the company, basically, now that you have these outside investors and you have a few years and you obviously have revenues, is relatively stable. Sort of, what is your, beyond the launch of the long sleeve t-shirt, which obviously sounds like that's going to be a bellwether event, what's your sort of medium long-term vision for the company?
We want every single person that lives in that fits our description of modern urbanite to not have a need for a winter jacket. We want them to be able to wear the long sleeve shirt that keeps them warm sub-freezing, and that's all they need. And that's our long-term vision.
It's funny, the other thing when you mentioned New York and Chicago, and I've lived in New York twice, and I've been to Chicago so many times. I mean, as people who know in these cities will be very acutely aware of, there's obviously also in the winter there's so many homeless people around, and you feel so sorry for them in those temperatures. I guess it could be like some sort of big philanthropic thing as well at some point in time, to just donate a bunch of your clothes to the homeless population.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. There are some brands that do a really phenomenal job with that, like Bombas is one with their socks, buy one, get one. And so I think that there is a really interesting opportunity for some philanthropic effort there. But that's a really, really good point, Raphael.
And where can people actually buy your clothes at the moment? I mean, I saw the online shop, but is it also in regular shops, or what are the distribution channels?
OROS is a digitally native brand, and an overwhelming majority of our sales are online, which means that the best place to find us is at www.orosapparel.com. Where
we'll be regularly going back to see whether that 39A NASA jacket is going to become available again. Please don't tell me that this is like limited edition and it's like not coming back.
We're exploring a restock, so it may be coming in the next couple months for sure.
Okay, fantastic. And I mean, speaking of products, I guess the other question I have to ask is, I'm obviously a space investor. I'm deeply involved in the space community, and as everybody else in the space sector, I'm currently getting excited about this moment in history when we are preparing to go back to the moon, and this time, if all goes well, to stay and not just to plant the flag and leave again, and ultimately, obviously, to go onto Mars as well, and hopefully settle in all of these places. And these places, especially at night, are very cold. And so, is there any sort of like long-term planning that you could collaborate with NASA on actual like in-space wear as well?
That would be a dream of OROS, the product team especially. We would be absolutely honored and excited to do that. And I think there's incredible application there. There was a great scientific publication that came out not too long ago on the ability to use aerogel to terraform Mars, make it a habitable planet. Long story short, within the aerospace community, whether it is apparel that allows you to thrive on foreign bodies like the moon or terraforming planets like Mars, I think there's a variety of areas of opportunity that we can be helpful.
That would be very exciting. And I mean, it's pretty much every other place we can go to in the universe is just going to be so cold. I mean, people are throwing around sometimes as well Titan, one of the moons of Saturn, as a future human colony. I mean, that will take time, right? But that's another place that's sort of like in the minus 200 degree centigrade temperature range. You certainly will need some special clothing there. Let me ask you a couple of questions that we always ask towards the end of these interviews. One is, if you weren't doing OROS, is there any other business opportunity that excites you particularly?
That's a great question. I am personally very interested. As I mentioned, I'm a tech geek. I'm a science geek. I think there's some really incredible opportunities with CRISPR. CRISPR is one of those technologies that 10 years ago would have been viewed as science fiction. Now that we're starting to understand what CRISPR can allow us to do as far as gene editing is related, it is pretty phenomenal. And there's a wealth of opportunity there. One of the areas that I'm really interested in is the opportunity to use CRISPR to create cures for some of the biggest genetic diseases in the world. I think there's going to be some really interesting developments there in the next decade.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, for those of our listeners who may not know, CRISPR is basically a gene editing technology. It's an acronym, and I won't spell it out because it's way too long. But I agree that's usually exciting. And then the other question we always finish up on is basically whether you like science fiction and what kind of science fiction, whether it's book, a movie, or TV series. But for you, given your business, I will actually split it into two questions. I mean, one is going to be our usual question is like, what kind of science fiction and specific examples do you like, if you like science fiction? But then, if possible, I'd also like you to comment on the sort of clothing used in science fiction, whether there's something you particularly like or not like, like Star Trek uniforms, things like that.
Ooh, that's a great question. Growing up, I was a huge, and still am, a huge Star Wars fan. And so I have a lot of comments and thoughts there, and it can go deep on that. The other, more recently, I guess in my teenage years and in college years, I started falling in love with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and especially Avengers. And my favorite character, unsurprisingly, is Iron Man and Tony Stark. And so I think if there's one, and I don't know if you can call his suit apparel, I guess in a way it is, right? But if there's one thing I would love to be able to wear, own, create, it would definitely be Iron Man suit.
Yeah, I hear that. I guess that's from the sort of, I assume that's from the functional perspective, but that's very cool. Aesthetically speaking, what is anything you particularly like? Like for me, for example, I think some of the Star Trek uniforms are very, very good looking. And if you guys want to make Star Trek uniforms out of aerogel, I might very well consider that.
Duly noted. I'll bring it up with the product team and the design team and see what they think. I'm sure they'll love the idea.
Okay, cool, Michael. Well, thank you so much. We're looking forward to your next product releases. The long sleeve shirt, that's going to be very exciting. And again, I keep repeating myself, but I'm really looking forward for the 9A jacket to come back to be available again.
Perfect. Raphael, thank you so much.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.